Automation Bootcamp. I think when Raz mentioned to me that we're planning to do a track on PowerShell, I was very keen to come and present how we can use PowerShell for the Power Platform, because I've been working with PowerShell and automation for over, I don't know, 6-8 years now, especially in the context of Dynamics and Power Platform. So as you know, Power Platform is a very kind of low-code, no-code platform. So many people who are normally involved with Power Platform don't normally tend to come across PowerShell a lot. So I put together this session to kind of give you a brief introduction into PowerShell and all the things you can do with PowerShell for the Power Platform, and some of the scenarios that you can find PowerShell useful when working with the Power Platform. So hopefully, if you've not used PowerShell before, or if you're advanced in PowerShell and want to know more, hopefully you'll find something useful that you can take and apply into kind of your day-to-day job from this session. If you have any questions during the session, just ping it on the chat or leave it till the end, and I'll be happy to answer you. So before we start, just a brief intro about me. So I've been working with the Power Platform and the Dynamics kind of products for over 15 years now, and been kind of focused as well a lot of my time on automation, especially around pipelines and administration for our Power Platform in the last, I don't know, 5-8 years or so. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, so if you want to reach out to me for any questions, I've put in a few links here on this page. So Twitter, LinkedIn, I've also have a YouTube channel that I've posted that one video so far. I'm hoping I can do more in there over time. Okay, so let's get started, and I'll start with a very basic introduction for PowerShell. So PowerShell is a command line shell. So basically, with Power Platform, you normally do a lot of things through the UI and the Maker portals. So this one is, the other way around. So you're working, with the command line. You're not really using interface. So you can, take inputs and outputs, but you're not really working with the UI. So it's basically a scripting language that allows you to write scripts to automate a variety of tasks. And initially, PowerShell, long time ago, it was aimed at administrative tasks. However, I think the scope of PowerShell has grown over the years, and you can do a lot more things with PowerShell today, including building Azure functions and pipelines and other things. So PowerShell has two editions. So you have the desktop edition, which I will be showing you today, which is based on .NET Framework and it runs on Windows. But there's also the kind of core edition, which is cross-platform, and that's based on .NET Core. So basically what PowerShell gives you, it gives you something called commands, or in the PowerShell terms, they're called commandlets. So basically, it's a piece of function that you can use, and you can pass the input parameters and it can give you output parameters. But there's other things you can do in PowerShell. So if you have utilities today like XCs, you can use that in PowerShell. It gives you access to some of the standard kind of command line tools as well, and you can write lots of scripts with PowerShell. So you'll see all of that hopefully in today's session. So from a getting started point of view, so if you're on Windows 8 or above, you already have PowerShell on your computer. So you should be able to start right away, actually. If you want to build scripts, I think you have a number of options. So you have the Windows ISE, which I'll be working with today. You can also download extensions for either Visual Studio or VS Code. So that allows you to create PowerShell projects, and you get some of the syntax highlighting and other features in there as well. But really, I mean, you could even use Notepad if you just want to, have a very simple script. So if you want to know what version you have, you just go into the command line and type this in, and it will tell you what version of PowerShell you currently have. Some of the modules that you use may rely on a specific version of PowerShell, or some of the commands may be available only in a newer version. So it's good to check the version and the module or command that you're trying to use to make sure you've got at least the minimum version required. And if you don't have that, you can download the latest version of PowerShell from GitHub. I've put in a link in here, and you can install it, on your machine or server. One of the very useful thing in PowerShell, especially if you're, working with, new commands and modules, is the help command. So if you're not sure what a specific command is doing, just use this help and command, and it will tell you exactly, what you need to pass in to that command. Okay, so when we're working with PowerShell, we're mainly working with scripts and functions. So that's what you probably most of the time you'll be building. So you either be building some script or some function to kind of abstract some of that logic. And the idea is that you're building reusable logic that you can automate tasks and you can call later. Typically, they will have a PS1 extension. Your script will take some parameters because you may want to use your script in various scenarios. So you want to parameterize your script, and same thing with functions. So you can take inputs and output parameters, and it can do some basic things. So the idea is that then you can combine all these different commands into scripts, and you can use these to automate various tasks, as you will see later in this session today. So once you have some piece of logic and you want to share it with more people, then we come into the concept of modules. So a module is just a packaging of a number of components that are developed using PowerShell. So it could be scripts, it could be functions, it could be other things, but basically it allows you to package your thing as a module and share it basically. So modules typically implemented using scripts, but you also have commandlets, which I will talk about later. And they typically have a metadata file, which basically describes, who's the author, what does it contain, what are the requirements for that module, any dependencies, and all this kind of stuff. So once you have created a module, you can publish it to the PowerShell gallery. I have a few PowerShell modules that I've published to the gallery. A lot of the vendors have modules that they publish into the gallery. So this is like your one-stop shop for anything to do with PowerShell. So you can go in there and download, different modules that extend the core capabilities of PowerShell. And when we're working with the Power Platform, we're going to be using some modules from the PowerShell gallery. So when you want to work with modules, there's a number of things that you need to do. So the first one is there's a number of commands within PowerShell that allows you to work with modules. So find module, allows you to search. Save module is very useful because you can, tell it to save the module into your local drive, and that is typically used to, have a look at the module, inspect the module, see what it contains, etc. If you want to use a module, you typically use the install command, and that stores the module in this location. So you'll probably see some already, out of the box modules in that location, but every time you install the module, it goes in that location as well. If you want to see the list of installed modules, again, you can use this. If you want to update the version of the module, because modules typically get updated regularly, you can use the update command. You can also take something off if you no longer need it. And finally, modules can be automatically loaded when you work with certain commands. But if you want to load a module from a specific location that you've saved previously, for example, using the save command, you can use the import module as well. And this can be useful when you're working with automation tools like pipelines, etc. So let's do a quick demo just to introduce PowerShell, and then we can move into more complicated scenarios. So let's have a look. So this is a sample script in PowerShell. So as you see, it starts with a PS1 extension. You typically can pass it some parameters. So parameters can have different types, like string, Boolean, etc. I think this thing is quite useful in terms of the error action preference if you've not used PowerShell before. So by default, if an error happens in the script, it will continue. So sometimes if you encounter an error, you want to stop the execution, it's very useful to have this. You can obviously write to the output to see what's going on. You can create functions. So this is an example of a function called getGreeting, which takes a name as a parameter and it returns values. So function can return values. Scripts like this one typically don't return values. And then you're able to use a function in your script, pass it the parameters. In PowerShell, typically pass parameters using the minus parameter name and then the value. And then you can also obviously write things to the console. So if you want to execute a PowerShell script, you typically use, you put the script name. Okay. And then if you want to pass parameters to the script, again, you can use the, the name. So if I just do this for now, for example, you can see it will type that greeting to the screen from this command. So this is the PowerShell ISE. So it's got some IntelliSense built into it. You can view different modules in here. So it's quite useful. So that's one of the ways you can build things. If you wanna, for example, see more details like in verbose, you typically do minus verbose, and then we'll show you all these verbose logs as well. So we've covered, I think, scripts and functions. In terms of commandlets, so commandlets, you typically start with the action and then, so what you want to do or the resource that you want to call. So if I want to get child items, it will basically list me all the contents in that folder. So you can see it's quite useful. So one of the useful things about PowerShell, it's based on objects. So it's not just typing text out, it's actually returning objects. So if I want to grab, for example, the name of the first folder in that directory, I could actually use standard programming kind of things. So I want to get the first item, and then I want to do the name, and it automatically recognizes what I'm trying to do here. So you can get the first item, which is another folder in there. So if you're kind of used to working with C# or JavaScript, it's very similar in terms of how you can work with objects. So that's a very quick intro into PowerShell. So let's start to talk about some of the scenarios and ways in terms of where you can use PowerShell as well. So I'll go back to the presentation. Okay, so I've tried to group this presentation into different scenarios. So in terms of like talking about different modules, which I'm going to cover as well, I tried to talk about scenarios. So let's look at some scenarios. So the first scenario is basically, you can execute PowerShell locally on your machine, as the example which I just shown you previously. So who is this useful for? I think this is useful for everyone. So if you're a developer, you're a maker, you're an admin, DevOps, automation, whatever your role is, I guess, on the project, you can execute PowerShell on your local machine, provided you have the right access. So why would you want to, or what would you want to do on your local machine? So you can automate repetitive tasks using PowerShell. So whether you're working with ALM, you're trying to build solutions or plugins, etc., you can automate some of these repetitive tasks. Sometimes to do a certain task, you may want to go into multiple portals and then do lots of clicks, and you want to repeat these things over and over again. So if you have that kind of scenario, you can create a simple PowerShell script that automates that for you, so you don't have to worry about, it can save you a lot of time if you do these repetitively. The other reason why you may want to use PowerShell for the Power Platform is some of the operations that you may want to perform on Power Platform, such as some of the settings may not be available through the UI. So PowerShell may be the only way of doing things. So that's another very useful thing as well. And typically you would want to use PowerShell and other automation tools. So before you use them in automation tool, you're likely to be able to test them locally, to execute them locally. So that's where you'd normally start, even if your end goal is to put these scripts somewhere else. So why use PowerShell to automate some of these things? I think the reasons are quite obvious. So once you automate something, it's repeatable, consistent. So every time you execute it, you're going to get the same thing. Instead of having, lots of documentation, whether it's, wikis or documents, if you create a PowerShell script that does exactly what you need to do, then that's almost self-documented because you can see what are the actions that you want to do. It's obviously reusable, you can share it, and because it's automated, there is less, room for errors as well. So that's PowerShell for local development. So I'll pause here for a second. Before I jump into PowerShell, I want to introduce another tool as well, which is kind of goes hand in hand with PowerShell. And this hasn't been around for very long. It's called the Power Apps CLI. And it does offer some of the things that you can do with PowerShell, or you used to be able, or you can do still in PowerShell, but you got another option now basically. So Power Apps CLI is a command line tool, primarily for developers and makers to kind of automate some of the ALM tasks. So to get the Power Apps CLI, you need to go into the a link to download. It's an MSI you install, and then you get all the components from that. There is a number of dependencies that you'll need for that, such as NPM, .NET Framework, and some of the IDEs as well. So you can install these if you haven't got them. So once you install it, you get the current version. But if you want to update the CLI to the latest version, you can run this pack install latest, and we'll get you the latest version. So there is a lot of features in the CLI, and there is more features coming. So, for example, some of the new things that are available now is management of environments of the Power Platform. You can also manage solutions, and you can create plugins, PCF, and package projects to work with them within Visual Studio as well. So perhaps I think we should just pause and maybe do a demo of that quickly. My screen. Okay, so once you install the CLI, you can access it using the pack. So that's the Power Apps CLI. So if you just type pack, it will show you what version you have. It will show you the list of commands that are already there. So for example, if you want to authenticate into a CRM environment, you can just do this, and it will show you what is required. So you can create a connection, you can delete a connection. So this allows you to reuse the connection basically once you are authenticated. So let's take a look at another one. For example, if you want to work with solutions, so you can do pack solution. It will show you, the list of things you can do with solutions. So if you want to, for example, list all the solutions, you do list, and we'll go into your CRM environment that you're connected to, and it will basically list you the solutions that you already have. For example, if you want to export, so let's do an export. Again, if you want to see how to do an export, you've got a number of parameters in there. So if you want to export, I think I've already done that previously, so I'll just show you what it looks like. So if you want to export, you just give it the solution name, whether you want managed or unmanaged, how long do you want to wait, and you give it the location of where you want to export. And if you do that, it will start exporting the solution, and then you'll have a solution locally. So you can kind of save some of these values that you pass into these commands. So if every time you want to export, for example, or do a backup, you can just, click one file, and it will just do that for you. So you don't have to go through the portal and, do number of clicks and wait. So it can save you time, and especially if you want to pass a number of settings to these, like, auto number or something, you can have these saved. So you don't have to remember which one did I click last time and which one did I not click. So this will run in the background and, export the solution to the local drive. And there is a lot more things you can do. So I encourage you to have a look at that documentation as well on the Microsoft Docs. So moving on. So the next one is the Power Apps Maker module. So this is a module that is available, published by Microsoft. So this is tailored at the makers. So it gives you all the functions that makers could use, when building Power Apps. So it allows you to look at your environments. There was a lot of functions around, Canvas apps, flows. So you can manage these, whether it's publishing, changing them, enabling, disabling, sharing them, and you can manage some of the connection details as well. So let's quickly show you that as well. So I have another script on here. So for example, let's clear the screen. So if I want to, for example, find out about all the flows in my environment, so there's a command called get flow. So that gives me, a list of flows that I currently have in the environment, and you can see the details on here. So for example, at the moment you can see, for example, this flow is disabled. So I have the option to enable it as well using, the PowerShell. So you might be wondering, where does this ID come from? In the PowerShell interface, I think the environment name is the GUID of the environment. So if you want to get the name of the environment, the GUID from the name, there is another PowerShell command you can use. I can show you. So this is basically saying, get me the environment, with that name, and then give me the environment name. So this is the display name. This is the ID, which is like the name. So if you do that, basically, you get this environment name. So you don't have to, and ideally you can store these in variables, so you don't really have to worry about the GUIDs. But so the current flow is disabled. So if I want to enable that flow, then I can do that as well using PowerShell. So this will go to the environment and it will enable the flow. So if I, get that flow now using, again, PowerShell, I can see that the status is likely to have changed. So you can see it's enabled. And if I want to disable it, I can then go back and turn off that flow. So you can see, if you have certain flows that you want to enable as part of some processes, or you want to share, Canvas apps and things like that, you can all do that using PowerShell and write some scripts to do that. So it can be quite powerful. Let's go back into the slides as well. There's a lot of modules I'm going to go through today. I'll try not to spend too much time on a specific module, but hopefully, it will give you an idea of, what the modules are, what are the scenarios that you can use each one for. So the next module I'm going to cover is the XRM CI framework. And you can tell that this module has been around for a while because it has the XRM in the name. And it was first released, over 7 years ago, I think, for CRM 2013. A lot of the functionality still applies to Power Platform and Dynamics today. So it does support the latest versions of Power Platform and Dynamics. So this module is a PowerShell module. It has a number of things in it. So primarily it has lots of commandlets and scripts that allow you to automate some of the manual tasks that you would otherwise do either on your development machine or when you're building pipelines and automated builds and releases. So let me quickly show you how it looks like. So this is actually the source of the module. So let's start with the metadata file. So this is that describes what the module is. So you can see, just to give you an example, if you download the module or if you're creating your own module, you will have to create this metadata file. It typically has a PSD1 extension. So it will list all the things like, where's the license, where's the help, what does it contain, etc. So let's quickly have a look on what this does. So this module contains two things. I think one of them is the commandlets. So the commandlets is just a way of extending the PowerShell out-of-the-box commandlets. So you've seen, for example, I showed you previously the get child item. So that's an out-of-the-box commandlet. It gives you, the list of items in a specific folder. But for example, if you wanted to have a commandlet that retrieves a record from Power Platform or Dataverse, then that is not available out of the box. So for example, you can build a DLL that you can add commandlets to suite of commandlets that you can use. So for example, if I want to get a record from Dynamics or Dataverse, I can create a commandlet. So the main thing about commandlets is, let me just go into the base class. So as a standard C# class, to create a commandlet, you have to extend from the command base, and then you just have to declare your parameters, and you can declare whether they're required or not, the type of the parameter, and then basically all you have to do is just implement two functions. One of them is what do you want to do in this commandlet. So in this case, my base commandlet is really just establishing a connection to Dataverse, and the end is just not using the out-of-the-box end process. So that's it. Basically, define some parameters and then build the logic using C# in this case. So if I want to build a command that, for example, takes a GUID and some of the details about a row in Dataverse. So again, entity name and then ID. So these are the parameters, and then you can go in here and then in the process logic you can retrieve the entity using the organization service, and then you can write the object back. So this is returning the output. So now the consumer of this commandlet can give a name and ID, and they get back the data within Dataverse using the connection string to connect. So this module basically contains a lot of these, as you can see on the screen. I won't go through in detail. It's open source. It's on GitHub, so you can have a look if you're interested. The other thing that this module contains is a lot of scripts as well. So these are scripts that are built on top of these commandlets, but not only these commandlets, also some of the Microsoft modules. So it's just another layer of abstraction. So for example, let's take a look at some of them. So we have a commandlet to export data that you would typically do manually using the configuration migration tool. So this takes a connection string as an input and some schema file, and then it will generate the data for you. So this, for example, uses some of the Microsoft libraries. So export configuration migration data file. So you give it a connection string, the output file, the schema file, and it exports the data for you. So it's just a wrapper. But you can also, there's also scripts for things like export solution. So if you want to export a solution, similar to the Power Apps CLI, you can take a connection string and all the different parameters, and you can use this commandlet, for example, export solution from here, and you can pass it a number of different parameters. So this script is ready for you to use. So if you want to export a solution using a script, you can just invoke this, passing it a number of parameters. Same thing for solution checker. So if you have Power Apps solutions that you want to check on your developer machine, I know you can do that, in the portal. You can do that in pipelines, but if you want to run it on your local machine before you actually, look at it before you actually submit your changes, then there is another script for that, and there's lots of parameters. This one does a lot more things. It checks the thresholds and can fail on certain things. So I won't go into too much detail, but basically I think the key message here is there's lots of reusable scripts here that are built on top of different libraries and commandlets that you can just take and use immediately to help you kind of build some of the automations. Okay. So if you want to run some of these scripts, for example, let's have a look. Actually, the solution has exported from the Power Apps CLI, so we can see in the temporary folder now. If we go back into here, you can see it progresses slowly, and then it finishes. So for example, let's take a look at some of the scripts that I created using this XRMCI framework. So if I'm building plugins in Dataverse and I want to deploy these to the CRM or CDS environment, then I have a script for that. So once I complete my plugin in Visual Studio, I don't have to do anything else. I can just click deploy, and that will deploy my plugin. I know you can do that from plugin registration tool and probably other tools as well. But if you just made a small change, you just want to deploy the plugin, it's a lot quicker do it using a script, I think, in some scenarios. So again, that deployed the latest version, including all the steps and everything into the dev environment. So hopefully that kind of give you some idea in terms of the things you can do from a development environment. If you have any questions as we go, just let me know. I can't see the chat, but Raz,
Hi,
maybe.
Will. Yes, there are a couple of questions. One question was related to how to actually use the commandlets. I think the question was, just taking a look now, that has been answered, I think, by one of the fellow attendees, is when you build your commandlet, how do you make it available to a script? That's the question.
Okay, good question. Unfortunately, there's a lot of details which I think would be good to go through maybe in a specific session in terms of how to build that. But so essentially, so these are the commandlets. So it's just a standard class library. So you create a standard class library basically, and you just have to add a reference to I think some of the PowerShell base libraries somewhere in here. I can't see it now. So once you basically add your commandlets and extend from the right classes, you basically compile this library, and that generates a DLL, and that's the container of all these commandlets. So if you want to use it in a script, you typically all you have to do really is just using the import module. So if you just have a DLL, you can just import that DLL in here. Now, so that's how you use the commandlet in your script. So you just point to the DLL and you import it. Typically, you wouldn't just do that, especially if you're publishing to the gallery. So you'd wrap your DLL, with a metadata file. So in this case, I'm saying that actually this metadata file contains these DLLs. So then when I load this module, the DLLs will be loaded automatically. So basically, that's how you do it at a very high level.
That's the question. That's all.
Okay, let's continue. I think we've got still a lot to go through, so hopefully we can finish everything. So we've done the demo. Okay, so this one is the next scenario, and it's to do with Azure Automation runbooks. So we've seen how we can run scripts locally, and I think there is different scenarios, for different use cases. So what you can do is with PowerShells, you can run these PowerShell scripts in your Azure Automation runbooks, and some scenarios may apply to Power Platform as well. So who is this for? So Azure Automation runbooks are typically for administrators, DevOps, or automation engineers. So these are the kind of typical roles that would create Azure Automation runbooks. But anyone can really create it, provided you have the right access, depending on the size of the organization. So what do you do with Azure Automation runbooks? You typically automate repetitive tasks as well. So same concept applies, but the use cases here are slightly different. So there's typically to do with administration, some of the governance, some of the compliance use cases. We'll show you, an example of that shortly. So why would you use Azure Automation runbooks? So imagine you have a thing that you wanna, or a specific task that you want to run regularly. So if you have something that wants to run in the schedule, I think Azure Automation runbook is a good way of achieving that, because it's got all these scheduling capabilities built in. If you have tasks that you want to perform but require very high level of privileges, so you may not have these privileges yourself, because when you have a high privilege, you can do a lot of things basically, and sometimes you can't restrict it. So if you're a Power Platform administrator, you can manage the whole of Power Platform, for example, but there may be a valid use case that you want to do basically that is valid, but you can't do it yourself. So in this case, what happens is you can create an Azure Automation runbook with a dedicated account that you don't have access to, and the admins can configure that job, and that job can run, and you can achieve your kind of what you were trying to achieve without necessarily you doing that on your local machine. The other thing as well is we basically we can do a lot of automation using connectors as well in Power Platform and using Automate. But some of the connectors, they don't have all the features. Sometimes PowerShell has a lot more features. So Azure Automation Runbooks is another way of kind of complementing that as well. So I'm going to introduce another module here for Power Apps. So there is another module called the Power Apps Admin module. So we've seen the Maker module. So the Admin module is tailored towards administrators, and it has, slightly different functionality, even though there may be slight overlap. So with this one, you can manage, fully managed environments and permissions. You can manage all the Canvas apps and the connection settings, and you can also manage some of the data loss and prevention policies, and I think some of the encryption capabilities as well. So again, tailored for modules. There is full documentation on it, so you can have a look. Sometimes just browsing through the documentation and seeing what is possible gives you some ideas or reminds you of something that you wanted to do, but you maybe weren't sure on how or when. So let's do a quick demo of the Azure Automation Runbook. So for this one, I need to go to the browser. By the way, this is the PowerShell gallery that I've been talking about. So, all the modules are here. So if you want to search for some of the older modules, and when I say older, the ones that have been around for a long time, you can, for example, type XRM. There's lots of modules in here you can download. So this is, the XRM CI framework that I've been referring to just previously. But if you want to look at some of the newer ones, for example, you do Power Apps, and the administration one, for example, comes one on top, and then it gives you some instructions. This is how you install the module, and this is if you want to deploy it to Azure Automation, and if you want to manually download it, have a look at it, you can as well. So before I jump into the Azure Automation, I just want to show you something actually locally. So imagine you're an admin, for example, and you want to configure some of the Power Platform admin settings. So for example, by default, there's a lot of users that can create environments. But imagine, there is a setting and you want to restrict that setting. So there is a setting in the tenant which basically allows you to disable environment creation by non-admins, and that by default is false. So if you wanted to set that setting to true, you can basically run the script, which is basically says set tenant settings, and then you give it these number of parameters. So if I want to execute that script, let's clear the screen. So if I apply the tenant settings, basically you can see all the values are currently false, except that one that I turned true is true. But you can turn on any other values by just putting the value in here. So if I want to quickly make a change, I want to turn this one to true as well. If I execute that script again, now you can see that we have this one set to true in the tenant as well. So again, some of these settings may not be available through the UI, so you have to do them through PowerShell. So this is a way of an administrator kind of setting some of the default policies. But for example, let's take a scenario in terms of how do you make sure that these policies remain set as they are, because somebody could be doing something else on the Power Platform, and having this access, they may switch some of these things off to test something or to work around something. They may forget to turn it back on. So let's take a look at a way of we can use Azure Runbooks to enforce that, for example. So to use Azure Runbooks, you need an automation account, which you can create in the Azure. I won't go into details on that, but basically that allows you to basically execute the runbooks. So I've created a runbook in here. So a runbook is just a PowerShell script with some metadata around it. So let's edit the runbook and have a look. So this is a simple runbook. So all it's doing is just taking one parameter, which is an expected environment policy, and then it's using some of the variables that you've defined. So in runbooks, you can define some parameters that you can reuse. So some of them could be variables, like here. So I've got a username and password. You can use service principals as well. I don't have at the moment a service principal with the level of access for this demo, so I'm using my kind of standard username and password. So with variables, you can encrypt them as well. So these two values are encrypted, so you can't see them actually when you execute this runbook. So what we're doing here, really, we're adding a Power Apps account. So to authenticate into the Power Platform, you need to add a Power Apps account. So I'm providing the username and the password, which is retrieved from these two values in here. And then I'm getting the admin settings, and then I'm checking the current value for this policy, or the disable environment creation by non-admins. And then this is the expected value. I get the current value, and then I compare them. And if they don't match, then I just fail the runbook. I mean, this is just a simple example. You could send an email. You could even set these policies here if they've been changed, etc. I think it's all up to you. I think there's a lot of scenarios that you can implement using runbooks with Power Platform. This is just a simple use case to illustrate the concept. So if you want to test the runbook, so I go into tests, and then you can say, I'm expecting the value to be true, and then you just run the runbook. So all of that is doing is just going into the, basically executing that script with that parameter, and you will see the results shortly. Now, you may be wondering, how did the Power Platform admin module automatically was used in here? Because I didn't specifically specify that I want to use that module anywhere. You can see I just referenced this Power Apps module directly. So the way you do that with runbooks is you have to go into the modules area within the automation account, and you can add any module from the PowerShell gallery or from other sources. So you can see I've added the Power Apps administration module. So what that basically does, it installs the module into the account, so you can use it in your runbook, so you don't have to worry about downloading it, etc. And these are the different, I think, variables that I've been talking about that I use in the runbook as well. So username, passwords. So any of these settings and configuration you can store in here that are fixed. The ones that are not fixed, you can pass it into the basically the script itself, and then obviously then you can create schedules. So I've got a schedule that runs every hour on here. So yeah, I think it's a powerful way of automating jobs using some of the Azure capabilities. So let's continue from the Azure runbooks. So the third thing I wanted to cover is a third scenario is DevOps pipelines. So who is this useful for? Primarily DevOps engineers. But I think anyone can really create pipelines. So if your role is to create automated pipelines for Power Platform, I think this is for you. So what PowerShell allows you to do for pipelines, it allows you to automate some of the builds and deployment steps. Now, why would you want to use PowerShell to automate pipelines? I think there is a number of 4 reasons that I could think of on why you would want to do that. The first one is to utilize some of the capabilities that are not available via the first kind of class extensions for things like Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions. So there's a lot of great tools that are, or capabilities that are available for Azure DevOps, like the Power Platform build tools, the Power DevOps tools. So these gives you a lot of capabilities to build your pipelines. But what if the capability is not there? Then you can resort into PowerShell, because PowerShell typically would give you a lot more options or flexibility in there. The other reason is to utilize, for example, another CI/CD system. So if you're in your organization, for example, you use TeamCity or Jenkins or any other CI/CD system, that there isn't a native extension for Power Platform, you can use PowerShell, because that will give you, most of the capabilities that you need to do. The other thing PowerShell gives you is portability. So if I'm using Azure DevOps today and I want to move into, I don't know, GitHub Actions tomorrow, then if I write my modules in PowerShell, then I can easily execute the same script in another system. So it gives you that portability as well easily. And the last reason that I mentioned here is sometimes a lot of the things that you do in pipelines and on your developer machine are one of the same. So you could package a solution on your developer machine. You could have the same process running in the pipeline. So if you do that in PowerShell, you have one script that you can run locally and in your pipeline. So that gives you some consistency, as opposed to using one tool in your dev and then another tool in your pipeline. So just a few things here to bear in mind. I think there's a lot of advantages with kind of using native tools, but here are some of the reasons why you may want to consider using PowerShell if some of these scenarios are important for you. So in terms of the modules, I think I'm going to mention this one because it's been around for a while. It allows you to manage instances. It's been deprecated, so if you're still using it, consider to move to one of the admin modules that I mentioned previously. There is a modules that also has been published by some of the Microsoft. I think some of the Microsoft engineers as well. So it's called Microsoft.xrm.data. I think that's been around for a while as well. So you can see it's very rich. It allows you to work with solutions, records, settings, ribbons, lots of things. Take a look at it. There's lots of documentation around it. You can use it in your pipelines as well. There is the Power Apps Checker module as well. So as you know, you can use Power Apps Checker from the UI and from the pipelines, but there is a PowerShell module for it as well, which gives you a lot more flexibility. So consider looking at that module if some of the other requirements don't meet your needs. And there's also a module for doing configuration migration. So if you're trying to automate the export of the import data from environments, you can not only do that using the configuration migration tool, but you can also do that using the PowerShell module in an automated way. So let me just quickly show you a demo of PowerShell within pipelines. So I have two pipelines that I've created. So one of them using the standard out-of-the-box tools. So let's just take a look at that. So very simple. So export solution would basically export the solution from the dev environment using a service principal. So you can see I'm using the connections to do that. And then the next one is to, so basically this one is going to generate this solution from the dev environment. And then the Power Apps Checker is going to run, the check on that solution. And if you go on some of the advanced settings in the Power Apps Checker, you can see they're limited. They're not as flexible, I guess, as the PowerShell module. So you can see you can fail the build based on the number of errors, and you can upload the analysis files, but it doesn't give you some of the other flexibilities. So if I execute this module, basically, let's go back. So at the moment, I think it's quite easy to set up, as you can see. So that's one of the advantages of using this. So if I go into the checker one, you can see I've got 1 high rule and then 5 medium. And you can use the, I think you can use the extension to look at the scan results, for example. So I can, you can see which ones are high, which ones are medium. So you can even filter them here. So you can see there is 1 high, which is basically, I'm retrieving all columns in one of the plugins, basically. So what if that was a valid scenario, for example? You may want to exclude that file, or this specific rule may not be important in your context. I mean, in this case, it might be important, but let's assume that, it's not important. So let's look at another scenario where I do the same thing using PowerShell. So this is another build, exactly the same thing, but it's done using PowerShell. So let's take a look at how to do that. So you can see all I'm doing here is PowerShell. So save module is the first step. So before you use PowerShell in your pipelines, you want to get the modules that you want to work with. So unless you're running on your private agents and you've pre-installed these modules on these agents, you probably want to download them from somewhere. So in this case, I am installing the NuGet provider because I'm running on the hosted Azure DevOps agents and it doesn't have the NuGet provider by default. And you can see I'm running that in my locals in the scope of my current user, which is the user that is running the build, because if I don't put this, it's going to run, in the scope of the whole agent, and I don't have access to the agent in the hosted agents. So the next step is to save the PowerShell module. So I'm using 2 modules here. So I'm using some scripts from the XRM CI framework. I'm using the Power Apps Checkers module as well. And I'm downloading a specific version into that directory. So once I have these modules locally, then I can start to, do some more things. So with PowerShell, you can either put your script in line here, so you can type whatever you want in here. There will be a limited number of characters, or you can execute a file. So in this case, I've downloaded this export solution that I've shown you previously. So all you have to do is just execute that script and then pass it a number of parameters. And the parameters I'm retrieving is from the variable group on here. So there's a number of different parameters like username, passwords, application settings, etc. So all I'm doing really here is just utilizing, these values from here. So that will basically give me the solution. I'm storing it in a specific folder, and then I can do the same thing with Power Apps Checker. So I can use this check solution script as well. The main thing here to note is I have this additional parameter to this script, and it's called override rules. So in this case, I'm saying that actually this column set, I don't want it to be high, I want it to be low. And there's lots of other parameters you can pass, like excluding files or only running a specific rule, etc. So if I look at what how this thing looks, I think when it executes, let's just go back. Sorry, let's just, yeah. Okay, so this is the latest execution. So if I look at the check solution, so now the results are slightly different because I've supplied this override for that rule. Now I'm getting 5 medium and 1 low as opposed to 5 medium and 1 high. So this is just one example of the things you could do, or an example of PowerShell giving you a little bit more flexibility than using the standard tools. The other thing is I could take these scripts and execute them in GitHub Actions. It will work straight away. I wouldn't have to do too much work. Or I could, for example, use them in other places as well. I could run this export solution on my local machine as well. So that's some of the reasons why you may want to consider, I think, using PowerShell in your pipelines. Okay. Let me just, I think we've got 5 minutes left. So there are modules for Power BI as well. I won't have chance to cover that today, but there is modules that I probably haven't covered today as well in addition to this. So feel free to have a look, but you can also automate some of the capabilities for Power BI as well. And finally, just some tips for using PowerShell with Power Platform. So create reusable scripts with parameters. I think that's quite important. If you find yourself that you're passing the same parameters over and over again, consider creating a wrapper script, which basically hard codes some of these values. So you can just execute that script and don't have to worry about the parameters. So you can do this on your dev machine if you find that you're deploying to the same environment, the same solution, etc. And ideally, you want to store your scripts in version control so you can see the history of changes. You can manage them. You don't want them just to be lying on your local machine. Don't put your credentials in the scripts, so that's very important. And then don't print the credentials to the console. So even if you're passing your credentials, don't print them. Don't rely on the tools that mask these credentials. It's better not to have a statement that prints your credentials in the console, just in case someone takes that script somewhere and runs it using a highly privileged account. So consider caching your credentials. So I think some of the built-in modules, they already cache the credentials, but if you're creating your own module, consider a way of caching the credentials on the machine, especially if you're creating something for developers so that they don't have to keep typing that in all the time. And if you create something reusable, consider publishing either internally within your organization or to the PowerShell gallery so other kind of users can consume it. And finally, align with the PowerShell standards and handle errors, because the last thing you want is a script failing, I think, but not knowing why it failed. Make sure you have enough logging and make sure you kind of handle all these errors that you expect to happen. So I think just to summarize, I think we've seen a number of different scenarios where you can use PowerShell with a Power Platform. I think there's lots of modules out there. Some of them been around for a while. Some of them are coming now, and functionalities being added, very regularly, either by Microsoft or by the community. And I think PowerShell gives you a lot of benefits. I don't think it solves all the problems, or you have to specifically kind of use it for everything. I think there are some scenarios where it's useful. So if you have these scenarios, then consider using PowerShell because it can add a lot of value. So I'll leave a few minutes for questions. If you have any questions.
Thank you once again, Wael. A lot of excitement in the chat. One of the common questions is around licensing. It's around, can we use PowerShell to assign licenses to the users?
Can you use PowerShell to assign licenses to the users? That's a good question.
So let me be specific. So one of the questions is, can you use PowerShell to assign the Power Platform license to a user? And then the other question is also similar, which is, can I use PowerShell to assign specific Office 365 licenses once the user is created using Azure AD Connect?
Okay. I'm not an expert on the Azure modules, so I'm not sure whether you can actually assign a license to a user. But what I know is that you can, if you assign the license to a group, then you can automate the assignment of a group to a user, if you know what I mean. So if you have a group that is linked to a license, because typically, I think you wouldn't assign a license directly to a user. You probably have a group that is assigned the licenses, and then you add that group to the user, and then the user gets the license as part of being of that group. So you can automate the assignment of the group to a user, and then the group would be linked to a license. So you can do that using the PowerShell APIs. You may be able to assign the license, but I'm not sure, to be honest. I've not tried it.
Well, there you go, guys. So as Wael confirms, is that obviously using AD groups is the way, and you can use PowerShell to do it in that manner. However, I think one of the common threads that we know about PowerShell usage is about user management, right? Mm-hmm. So I understand your question. User management with PowerShell is very important. There's another question here for asking, can the PowerShell scripts be scheduled to run at particular times by Praful?
Yeah, I think, well, there's a number of ways you can schedule PowerShell scripts. So I think Azure Automation Runbooks is one way, which I've shown you. So that's a good way of scheduling the scripts. Azure DevOps, you can create a build, for example, or a pipeline that runs on a schedule as well. I think the Automation Runbooks is probably more tailored towards scheduled jobs. But in theory, if you've got any scheduler in your organization, that schedules job, you can just get it to execute a PowerShell script. So I think, yes, you can. I think there's lots of different options depending on what you're trying to do.
And Igor has shared the PowerShell script for assigning licenses within Microsoft 365. Thank you for that, Igor and Krakow. And yes, Ben is up next. Perfect timing. So once again, thank you, Wael. Like I said, there's always lots of excitement on your session. A lot of applications, as you know, where big challenge on Power Platform projects is on ALM and deployments. So once again, thank you, Wael. Do you have any final comments or anything you would like to share with the community?
No, thank you for joining, actually. It's a great event. There is a lot more exciting content. So I'm looking forward to the following session.